Welcome, everyone. My name is Auguste. I'm currently in the process of wrapping up my PhD at the University of Tübingen with Jakob Macke. And yeah, thanks so much for having me at this workshop. And I'm very excited to present my work on deep generative models for linking neural spiking activity and behavior. And I'll talk about two projects, and both of which are actually not based on transformers. So it's a bit of a change here. But like deep probabilistic generative models. So like most people at this conference here and also at this workshop, we assume that we have some behavior that can be possibly like complex or unconstrained and high-dimensional neuropopulation activity. And we all know that both of them can be highly variable. And like in the projects that I will talk about, we aim to ask with our approaches if we can generate all possible behaviors that are likely given some neural activity pattern. And conversely, like, can we model all possible neural activity patterns that are likely given some specific behavior? And that's where the probabilistic component really comes in. So in short, we want a model that's like very similar to diffusion models, like all of you for image generation. So all of you know DALL-E or stable diffusion, where you can generate images that you condition on text. And we basically want to build the same thing just for neural and behavioral data. And yeah, so I will not talk about like pre-training or anything in this setting, but really just these probabilistic deep generative models. And we don't train on many different data sets, but I'm very excited for what is to come there with all the other methods that were presented here today. So yeah, let's first dive into the generative modeling paradigm. So in gray, we here have the data distribution of different neural population sequences. And each trial here can be considered as a sample from this true data distribution. And the goal of a generative model is to approximate this distribution, so here like with Q of X, such that once we have trained this model, like we can sample from Q of X and generate data that actually looks like it was drawn from the original data distribution. And this, of course, also holds for behavioral sequences, for example. And yeah, but right now what I presented here is like we considered both of these modalities in isolation, but we very often want to link neural activity and behavior. And in such a generative modeling paradigm, this then actually corresponds to calculating conditional distributions. So we want to condition the respective distributions. So if we want to link it, here we would now constrain this distribution that generates neural spiking activity on a specific behavior, and conversely, the behavior would then be conditioned and constrained to a particular region that then looks like this behavior is happening during a particular population sequence. And I think here COSYNE, like everyone already knows that it's quite convenient and useful for many aspects of neural data analysis and visualizations to account for the fact that most variability in neural activity and behavior can often be captured with low-dimensional dynamics. So this is our second model desiderata, that besides being able to generate from these conditional distributions, we want to account for the fact that we actually have low-dimensional underlying dynamics. And one model class that is both a generative model and has this low-dimensional structure in baked are variational autoencoders. So they are really convenient for this task. So you have this like encoder that maps the data distribution to like the posterior distribution over the latents, and then you map it back up to the data distribution. And one of the things that is challenging for such VAEs is to actually generate these arbitrary conditional distributions. So there's conditional VAEs that are very good if you have simplified tasks, like clear conditions. But if you want to have these like very variable neural and behavioral trajectories, that conditioning is not trivial in VAEs. So what we did, and like I was very happy for the shout out by Yizzy earlier, was to think about recasting these encoding and decoding distributions as modeling such conditional distributions. And these many tasks that we try to model in neuroscience basically just like boil down to calculating conditionals. And that's both for like decoding behavior given neural activity, for encoding neural activity given behavior, but also like for things like modeling region A given region B. So we then wanted to just like generalize this, and the way how we came up with is if we are able to have a joint model of these modalities that we put into the model, and if we then can model the masked distribution of a masked data subset given an observed data subset, this can be a unifying conditional distribution for all of these distributions of interest. And for that, we propose to use mask variational autoencoders. And here we put in neural activity and behavior jointly. So we don't just use the behavior as a conditioning variable, but we really just like model these together, which then also accounts for the fact that both of them can be highly high dimensional. And so then during training, for example, here, if we want to model then the behavior given neural activity, we would mask out the behavior at test time, but also like then during the whole training process. So we mask different inputs and then compute the loss, and that's also a bit different from pre-training and transformers. We then compute the loss only on the observed data set. And then during training, we iterate through this and put in the different masks that we're interested in at test time. And just like very quickly to show that this kind of worked or not just kind of worked, but actually in a Gaussian example where we have the access to the true posteriors and conditionals. In this case, we use a Gaussian latent variable model where we here have like one latent dimension Z and then different data dimensions X. And we, for example, like then a test time mask out one variable. Here it's like X3 and have the other ones observed. We then look at the conditional distribution of the mask variable given the remaining observed ones. And here in red is our mask variation autoencoder approach that, as you can hopefully appreciate, perfectly matches the true conditional distribution. And versus like if one would take this like very naive approach of just putting in like zeros at test time without preparing the VAE for that, which is like a really bad idea to do if you have neural data, because like zero actually means something. Not having a spike is an information. So that really gives you the wrong distribution. So you should never fill in zeros from missing data. So we then like applied this also to neural and behavioral data. I will also only very briefly talk about this to move on to the next model. Is that we showed that you can sample from the decoding distribution. So here it's like the decoded mean, and the O'Doherty task is continuous reaching, and but then also use the exact same VAE to query the encoding distribution, so the neural activity given behavior, and can also sample from this. So yeah, I will not go into detail here. You can check out the paper for that. But then next we ask if we can actually also leverage denoising diffusion probabilistic models for neural spiking data, because like they've been very successful across various domains, in particular with like the fidelity of the generated samples in both audio and images. So we wanted to apply this to neural data. So just like very briefly, DDPM, so denoising diffusion probabilistic models, act on the principle that's similar to the diffusion process from physics. So you, at each diffusion time step, you add a little bit of noise to your data. So here, these are different time series, and gradually do this in many different time steps until it looks as if it's just drawn from Gaussian noise here on the left. And then when training a DDPM, we train a neural network to basically reverse this process. So to denoise the time series, and that's the aspect which we learn, versus the noising process is fixed. And when you then have trained the model, you can just generate a Gaussian noise sample and use your DDPM to gradually denoise it and generate data that looks as if it's drawn from the original data distribution. And there's a few DDPMs that have been used to show that it actually works really well on neural time series. A particular shout out to Julius Vetter, another PhD student in our lab, and Richard, who have set this up together with Jakob, where they nicely showed this for continuous time series for EG and ECOG and LFPs, that you can really generate very nice realistic neural time series. But in that model, they did not particularly focus on exploiting the underlying low-dimensional structure in neural activity. So this is what came in our project, that we want to focus on the latent diffusion approach. And this work I did together with another grad student, Jay Kapoor, who's also amazing. And that was a really fun project. And we came up with latent diffusion for neural spiking data. And just I'll walk through the individual bits step by step. So we have an autoencoder, and there, like Memming also mentioned this yesterday, there's like these new architectures, S4, like state space models that can be used. So our autoencoder is also S4 based, but this is like more technical detail. But we have an autoencoder, and you can use the autoencoder of your choice to map high-dimensional discrete spiking data to smooth low-dimensional latent. So we use additional regularization to get smoothness in the latent space, which is then particularly important for the DDPM, because like they usually in the current form act on Gaussian or continuous data. So that's the next step then it's a two-step model. So we first train the autoencoder that's separate, and then the denoising model on the smooth low-dimensional latents. And there we use, again, a bidirectional diffusion model with S4 layers, and then have a generative model of the latents we inferred from the model. And what is really nice about DDPMs is that they can be really flexibly conditioned on external variables. So earlier I showed you this like text example from which you could then generate images. So there's like a lot of good work in a way faster moving field than ours that then nicely like prepares all these things. So we then use this for conditioning on behavioral variables of different modality types. And then later on, we just like can evaluate it and look at downstream tasks. So first, we validate LDNS. I think everyone here has at some point in their life also like generated synthetic data from a Lorentz system. So we did this to validate it, and then trained the whole process, and then sampled latents from it. So always when I show things that are in red, this is like samples from the DDPM, like from LDNS in total. So in this case, it's just sampled latents. And here we have an 8-dimensional latent space, but just shows three projections. And this is the original length that the data that it was trained on, the model. But one thing that's really nice about the architectural choices is that you can actually have length generalization. So here you could generate signals that are 16 times, and like we didn't cut it off there, like you could do it for longer, but I think this suffices to show that even though it's way longer than what it was originally trained for, it still preserves the architecture, the geometry of the Lorentz attractor. And then we moved on to motocortical recording. So this time it's the maze task from Krishna and Kaufman, and there you can basically, like, at least to me, it's not possible to say if something is data or an LDS sample. And we then also quantified this, and that's again like what was discussed yesterday a little bit, that we need benchmarks. I also think it would be great to have a benchmark for the realism of generated spikes, because like we then came up with population level and single neuron statistics. So population spike count histogram here on the left, and mean ISI, standard deviation of the ISI, and then also compared it to different VAE-based approaches that are also generative models in neuroscience. And yeah, saw that LDNS performs like better on par with other methods. But one thing that like a Poisson-based model cannot capture typical like single neuron properties, such as like the refractory periods, burstiness of neurons, all of these things that are private to an individual neuron. So this is shown here in this like autocorrelation that is not well captured with a single Poisson process. So this was like the stochastic process of going from rates to spikes. We, in the original setting, used Poisson, but then we showed that you can post hoc train a more expressive observation model that's basically like GLMs, like also many people here, here know that can be added onto it. And then you learn spike history filters. You could also do couplings to other neurons as well, which we didn't do in this paper, but of course it would be possible to do as well. And that very nicely corrected this autocorrelation. And we showed that it did not just correct and improve this autocorrelation, but also the other statistics that I showed before. So it did not deteriorate than the other metrics. And quite nicely, we could also apply it, and I see Chathan nodding here, we could also apply it to other VAE-based methods. So we showed that we also improved the realism of the spikes from auto-alphas. And so this can be just like as a modular component, you can just add to other methods as well. And yeah, and then I think the most fun part, the most interesting, is to now condition it on behavior. So we now trained a different diffusion model, but could reuse the same autoencoder. And we condition in one setting on scalar, like the angles, the reach angles, and the other one entire time series velocity conditioning. So to test out the abilities to have different forms of conditioning. And then we can generate fake neural activity that should look as if it's drawn from, like as if this reach angle was happening, and then compare with using like this rich regression decoder from NLB, again, this neural latence benchmark, to compare if they actually match. And yeah, I wouldn't be so excited about this if it hadn't worked. So it's quite nice to see that actually again, this is now the decoded behavior from the fake activity, and colored according to the conditioning angle, and one can nicely see that the overall kinematics of the reaches are preserved, but also the color wheel makes sense. So it's consistent with the queried reach angle. And even cooler, I think, is this aspect of putting in an entire time series. So that here in white is the test condition that we put in. And then in red around it are samples from the model. So you also then don't just get one best trajectory, but you can get many different samples, because as I mentioned before, it's like highly variable, and we want this to be reflected in our model, that we don't always get exactly the same trajectory, but you can see that these samples are very similar and close to the actual queried reach velocity. And then we moved on to a more challenging data set, which is like super cool from Willett and others, where they could decode attempted speech from neural activity. And it's very challenging because like it has like very like variable trial length. So like from like 2 seconds to 10 seconds, and that's something that's very challenging for many like machine learning models to deal with efficiently. And also here, like at the top is like the data of like 2 different trials that are like very different lengths. And then we can train LDNS on this and sample and query which length we want to have. So overall, like, and I think this is like also the area where then foundation models would be most useful for these kind of tasks, because like it's very tedious for this person to generate a lot of data. And if you can then have a foundation model that actually allows to generalize to other patients, that would be fantastic. So the take-home message from this talk for me is like that we, in the first project, we recasted encoding and decoding as calculating conditional distributions and use deep generative models to then sample from them. And LDNS is a very flexible model that combines a regularized autoencoder with flexible diffusion models on the smooth low-dimensional latent space. And it can generate high-quality samples and allows for flexible conditioning on behavioral variables. And with this, I would like to thank this wonderful group of people. I think many people wanted to take a photo of this slide. Sorry, I moved on too quickly. Okay. Yeah, I would like to thank this wonderful group of people that made my last couple of years, my PhD, really fun, despite some difficult parts, of course, as well. But, and then in particular, my advisors, Jakob Macke and Pedro Gonçalves, and then the 3 people with whom I worked closest on these 2 projects, Jay, Julius, and Richard, and also my collaborators at EPFL, Daniel Morales, Victor Labaterios, Pavan Ramdia, in particular Felix as well, who worked with us on the LDNS project, which was also fantastic to have him in the lab. And yeah, if you like the kind of work that we do, there's open positions in the Macke lab. And I think Richard also has posted something about a startup that builds foundation models for neural data. So also talk to him. Yeah, thanks so much.